Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kira Mudd, and on behalf of the URI Foundation and Alumni Engagement, I'd like to welcome you to our program today. We're happy to present our second Faculty Office Hour discussion for the fall semester. Today, we welcome two professors from the College of the Environment and Life Sciences to discuss their research on marine birds. If you have questions for the faculty today, please post them in the Q&A section on your screens. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. And just a note, today's program will be recorded. In a few days, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording, along with recommended resources for further reading. You'll also be receiving a very brief survey from us. We welcome your feedback. Now, I'd like to invite Professor McWilliams and Professor Paton on screen to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kyra, for starting our introduction. So as Kyra said, we're here to tell you a little bit about offshore wind and marine birds. My name is Scott McWilliams. I'm a professor here in the Natural Resources Science Department in the College of Environment and Life Sciences. Most of my research is focused on ecology and physiology of wildlife in general, but most of the focus is on marine migratory birds, and that's what we'll talk about today. Peter, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Paton. I've been at URI since 1995. I'm a conservation biologist. I'm an ornithologist. I'm really interested in marine birds. Terns and plovers are the species that I specialize with. So what we wanted to do today is do a brief introduction to marine birds and offshore wind. This is something that Scott and I have been working on for the past 2 decades. A lot of this research, we want to thank a lot of our collaborators over the last 2 decades that have helped us. This has included a number of graduate students and postdocs and other collaborators. So we thank them. And so a lot of what we're talking about is based on the data that we as a group have collected over the decades. So what I wanted to do at first, we're going to tag team this talk. I wanted to just give you a brief introduction to offshore wind. And that's where I'm going to start out with my section of the talk. So just to get us all to speed, if you look at offshore wind development across the globe, you can see from this graphic that China is the world's leader in terms of offshore wind, followed by the United Kingdom and Germany and the Netherlands and Denmark, even Vietnam and Taiwan and France. And particularly starting in about 2020, so about 4 years ago, China really escalated the amount of offshore wind they've been developing. Things are picking up a little bit in the United States. If you look at this is offshore wind under construction as of December 31st in 2023. You can see that the United Kingdom and China are leading the world efforts, and then Taiwan and the United States are following those countries. So this just gives you some idea of where all this development is taking place across the globe. If you look at the wind resources for North America, those areas shown in purple are the areas, purple and reds, the darker colors are the areas where there tends to be the most wind resources. So that includes the Midwest. So from Texas up to South Dakota, there's an area of lots of wind. And then on the Pacific coast, from California to Washington, and then on the East Coast, particularly from southern New England up through Maine, is where there's lots of offshore wind resources. So if you look at the current distribution of wind turbines in the United States, each yellow dot represents a wind turbine. You can see that there's been a lot of development in the Midwest from Texas through South Dakota, Wisconsin, and then inland areas in Washington, Oregon, and then also we go to eastern United States. So most of the wind development that's taken place so far has been in inland areas, and that's also where a lot of our understanding, at least in North America, about interactions between wind turbines and land-based bird populations have occurred. There's much less known in the offshore environment because it just started to be developed in the United States. So this graphic shows wind lease areas in New England. So those areas in green are the areas that are being leased. And the areas that are with the red blocks are where there's existing wind turbines. So the Block Island Wind Farm, South Fork Wind Farm, and Vineyard Wind are the three areas that have already been started to be constructed. They just, if you look at north of us in the Gulf of Maine, they just leased some blocks in southern part of the Gulf of Maine. But so most of the offshore wind development that's taking place in the United States is in southern New England. And if you look at the current distribution of offshore wind turbines, again shown in the yellow dots, you can see it. So the Rhode Island, in Rhode Island waters off of Block Island is Deepwater Wind, which was the first offshore wind facility, which we had a role in. And then South Fork Wind, which is funded by New York. So the cables from that go to Long Island. And then for Massachusetts, Vineyard Wind is another facility that's being constructed right now. And then the next facility that's going to be constructed is Revolution Wind, which about 50% of the power is going to go to Connecticut and 50%, a little bit over 50% to Rhode Island. So that's a current, and that construction will start in a year or so. So that gives us some idea of the current distribution of offshore wind in our area. So given all this recent development in offshore wind, how does it impact bird populations? So there's really two things that could take place, and based on all the research in land-based turbines and then offshore wind, collision risk is a factor. Birds colliding with the turbines and the monopiles and causing mortality events. And the other key thing, particularly for birds in the offshore environment, is displacement from key foraging and roosting sites. And so because we're just now starting to get wind turbines in the offshore environment, we have to go to Europe, where there's been turbines in offshore environments for over 2 decades, to look at interactions between wind turbines and birds. And there's been done a lot of research in Europe looking at collision risk. What's the probability the bird flying through an area is going to hit a turbine? And based on the research that's being conducted to date, for the most part, and I'll show some more evidence of this, is that birds, for the most part, are pretty good at avoiding turbines. And so the collision risk doesn't seem to be a major factor in the offshore environment. In the land-based turbines, collision risk can be a major problem, and it has been a major problem. And there's been work done to mitigate it. But in the offshore environment, it seems as though collision risk is less of a factor. And let's look at some of the evidence for that. So the other thing to do is looking at work in Europe, and looking at doing extensive surveys in offshore wind turbines. Some species show strong avoidance. They don't go near the turbines. That includes things like red-throated loons and northern gannets and northern fulmars. Some species tend to show weak avoidance. They tend to avoid them to some extent, and things like long-tailed duck and sandwich tern and black scoters. Some species are somewhat indifferent to it. They can fly through them and they maneuver around them, such as common and Arctic terns or other things. And then weak attraction, a bunch of gulls, and then some species like cormorants will go and they're attracted to the wind turbines and they'll roost on them too. If you look at a little bit more in depth in this, here's a study that was done in Denmark. So the upper panel shown here, the black dots represent the Horns Rev wind facility. The black dots represent turbines. So this upper panel represents one that before the turbines were in place. And this dark pattern shows the density of common eiders, these birds shown on the right, pre-construction, what they did as they migrated through the area. And the key area where they migrated through is right through where the wind turbines were placed. After the turbines were constructed, their migratory patterns changed. So the main density of migration was south of the wind farms and some going north of the wind turbines. So that in general, they tended to avoid flying through the offshore wind facilities. And that's reflected in this lower figure that kind of accumulates it. And so the areas in dark show the high density of birds. The areas in white show low density of birds. So there's a strong evidence of avoidance from the wind farm. If you look at the same area, looking at radar tracks for common eiders moving through the area, you can see that most of the birds are going around the turbines. And then those individuals that do go through the offshore wind facility, they're doing a straight direct flight right through the middle of the wind farm, and they tend to maximize their distance between wind turbines. So they obviously detect the wind turbines, and they show some evidence of avoidance for the wind farm. Another line of evidence is this is data for red-throated loons, referred to as red-throated divers in Europe. And so you have these offshore facilities in the North Sea, and what they did a series of transects prior to the construction of the wind turbines and then after the wind turbines were constructed. And they came up with estimates for the density of birds pre and post construction. So this left-hand set of panels represents the density of red-throated loons before the turbines went into place. And the areas that are dark blue and the darkest blue are the areas with the highest density. So you can see, for example, in this one set of wind turbines, the highest density was right near where before those wind turbines were put into place. The same thing here. So, sorry, was it not working? So this right-hand panel show post-construction and the densities, and you can see that the areas in yellow represent low densities. So there's been a major displacement of red-throated loons from these offshore wind turbines. So if you compare this panel to this panel, you can see here there was high density prior to the construction of the offshore wind farms. There's low density now. Again, here, low density here, and that's really striking here. It's just very low density around these wind turbines. So based on these data, these loons are displaced anywhere from 9 to 12 kilometers from the offshore wind farm. So some species are very sensitive to the construction of wind farms. Another way to look at this is to put radio transmitters on birds and look at their movements. And so they did this with common murres, which are referred to as guillemots in Europe. And you can see the movements of the guillemots from the breeding colony. They're going to areas to the south and to the east of the wind turbine, but they're avoiding flying through the wind farm. So more evidence for some species really are avoiding the wind farms.
Okay, switcheroony. All right, so Peter provided you with sort of the background that we had as we were considering how to help influence the offshore wind energy development off of our coast. And so what I'm going to talk about is the process that we went through as part of that siting. So this is the general study area. Southern New England, we all know it well. The context, so we started this project in 2009. And at that time, in the dotted line is showing you our study area. So specifically, we were tasked with figuring out what the marine bird distribution and abundance was in that area. It's roughly 30 kilometers off the coast, a little bit wider. But in 2009, when we started this, there was also a proposal to put a wind farm in Nantucket Sound, right about where the A is in Nantucket. And that started in 2001. And the story we're going to tell you is sort of a contrast between how typical development gets assessed, that's what happened in Nantucket Sound, versus what we did as part of the the Ocean Special Area Management Plan that I'll describe in a little more detail. So I can already tell you what the end of the story is. So the Nantucket Sound wind farm was evaluated in the way that we normally do development assessment. And that was the developer came in and said, we'd like to put the wind farm right about where the A is in Nantucket. They hired some consulting firms to evaluate what the bird distribution and abundance and whales and sea turtles were in that area. And they spent a couple of years doing that. And it ended up in litigation for the next 15 years. And it eventually did not get built. I'm going to contrast that now to the way we were part of the Ocean SAMP and why I think it was more successful. So what's a special area management plan? So Rhode Island is one of the originators of this kind of planning policy framework. And I've outlined 4 main features of special area management plan. In the map on the right is shown some of the special area management plans that have been done in the land environment. So there's a Narrow River special area management plan, a Greenwich Bay one. The one I'm describing today is the first one that was done in the offshore environment. So special area management plans all share these 4 features. It fosters an ecosystem-based management approach. So it's immediately a broader scale than most of our assessment kind of processes. It promotes and enhances existing uses. It encourages wise economic development, and it builds a framework for coordinated decision-making. Each step in the process involves public input, and we were involved in some. So the first step in the Ocean Special Area Management Plan, otherwise known as OSAMP, was didn't involve us. It was looking at wind resources and other things that they call deal breakers. So each of these figures is showing you each of those. So the wind speed is in the upper right, and as you get darker red, there's more wind. So in our part of the world, the further you get off the coast, the more the wind speed is to your benefit when you're building an offshore wind facility. The bottom right is showing you the shipping lanes. So in white there are places that were not available for any offshore wind. They were established shipping lanes that were taken off the table immediately. And then the various colors, the blues and the grays, were the result of geological surveys. So one of the things back in 2009 they had to worry about was the rock bottom and where they could actually put pilings into the bedrock. And some areas that were in blue were much less good for that purpose. And the ones in the darker reddish and brownish colors were ones that had better geologic basis. So the bottom line here was there's only certain places where a wind farm developer would actually want to put these things. And that map in the bottom right sort of defined where those places were. We were involved in the second tier, and that was 30 different research teams that measured everything from that bedrock geology to primary productivity, what was living on the bottom, the benthos, primary productivity, the fisheries, the marine mammals, sea turtles, and marine birds is in big and bold in the bottom because, of course, they're the most important of all those. No, that's because we're talking about those today in particular. But the key thing was these 30 different research teams had already decided at the start that we were going to measure all these various things in a 4-kilometer square grid cell across the entire area. So the reason why that's so important for us as marine bird folks is we had access to primary productivity data, to water depth, to bedrock type, to benthos, to fisheries, the whole 9 yards. And you'll see that that was really instrumental in being able to do what we were able to do with this marine bird assessment. All right, so how do you go about measuring distribution abundance of things? In our case, we used planes. The blue lines are the transect lines that the plane flew. So we had 24 of those. The yellow lines are the state waters boundary. And then the purplish line is our study area, that special area management plan area. So we flew these things twice a month for about 2.5 years. And the kind of data you get from that is shown here for just one species. So this is common loons. So the bigger those dots, the more there are. The biggest dot in this particular depiction is about 20 birds. And then the smaller dots are where there's only a few. And if you don't see a dot, we didn't see any loons over the course of this particular set of surveys. Okay, so you can all immediately just see where the bigger dots are. The bigger dots tend to be more coastal. In the case of common loons, they also like to be around Block Island. And then the different colored backgrounds is the water depth. And so you can start to see that there might be an association between where common loons are and where shallower waters are. But we can make that more explicit because now we have access to all these resource layers, the primary productivity, the water depth, et cetera. And we can convert that raw data of how many birds we see over time to what we call a density surface model. So each of those little pixels is 4 kilometers squared. That's what we all decided to collect the data at that spatial scale. And the darker those cells, the higher the abundance, the density of common loons, okay? And we can only do this because we can predict where the common loons were based on our distribution data with all these resource layers underneath. So we can build predictive models that incorporate all those environmental covariates. So there's the depiction that you get for common loons. You can also integrate that over time. And when we did that, we ended up estimating that there were about 5,000 common loons that were wintering in our area. That happens to be about half of all common loons thought to breed in the New England area. So it's clearly a very important area for common loons during the winter. And you can do the same exact thing for each species that we measured, but in this case, we could also do it for a suite of 4 sea duck species. So these are 3 scoter species that are relatively common in our area, and then the common eider, which Peter has already introduced you to from Europe. And same kind of thing, right? This is the density surface model that comes out of this. Just like the loons, they tend to be much more abundant in shallower waters near coasts. That includes Block Island in our particular case. And if you integrate across, you can get a daily estimate. So in the winter, in this area, we roughly have about 12,000 individuals that are wintering off our coast. It's a very important area for sea ducks in the winter. All right, so we did this for all the various species. And you can look at our Ocean SAMP chapter, and you can see for each individual species or groups of species exactly what those distribution models look like. One of the outcomes of that was that all the areas that you see in white on the map to the right, so there are all these coastal areas, including around Block Island, were taken off the table for any kind of offshore wind development. Why? Because those areas had the highest density of marine birds by far. And essentially those white areas are the areas less than 20 meters deep. So they were off limits to offshore wind. The areas in pink were the areas that were still being considered. They called them areas of mutual interest. So these were the areas that developers paid most close attention to. They were essentially where they could consider putting offshore wind. And that was some combination of both marine birds and all the other aspects that were studied as part of the Ocean SAMP. And as a result of all this, by 2016, we had the first offshore wind farm in the US. And that's a picture of it in the upper left. There's the 5 turbines that are right off of Block Island. It's within state waters. It's within 3 miles of Block Island, which meant the amount of permitting that was required was much less than the federal permitting process. So that was part of the reason why it was put where it was. And I give you some of the data for how much energy it's producing. So there's 5 turbines, each of them have a maximum of a 6 megawatt output. So that's 30 megawatts, energy for 17,000 homes. If you've ever counted how many homes are out on Block Island, it's less than that. So yes, the Block Island wind farm at peak capacity can easily provide energy for all the Block Islanders. They actually send a lot of energy back to the mainland from that wind farm. And importantly for the Block Islanders, it replaced the diesel generator that powered the island before that. It's now just the backup. And there's been continued monitoring of the Block Island wind farm. As Peter alluded to, in Europe, we knew that collision risk was pretty low. It's the same out on the Block Island wind farm. So the key thing that comes out of that is if you prioritize where to place these at the outset to minimize any kind of displacement of birds, that's going to be your primary way to reduce a negative effect on marine birds. So we want to digress for just a second about how you use this kind of information, because it's pointing out one of the other aspects of development and assessing development that we wanted to highlight. So the first thing was there's the special area management plan process that we think is way superior to the way we normally assess development. But this particular digression is about how do we evaluate different kinds of species. So typically in the US, we take a single species or taxa approach. So if you love common eiders in this particular case, we show you where the pixels are, where they're most abundant. And in that background, pinkish color is the proposed offshore wind energy areas. And you can see that if you're only interested in common eider, then there's probably not going to be a problem. Maybe around the southern parts of Block Island, but pretty much they're not using areas where there's development. So that would be a single species taxa. But using the data that we've collected, you could actually integrate across all marine birds if you wanted to. So this is just saying, where are all the marine birds? Where would you want to, anything with the colored blocks or areas that have at least the top 20% of areas that marine birds are using. And now you might have some concerns about certain portions of that area that's being proposed for development. But what if you didn't want to just value every single species the same and you put higher value on some, right? And in our case, we love sea ducks and we love terns. So if you valued those more, but then you still considered the rest of them, look how the map changes. There's less area that's out here in that proposed wind farm area that would potentially be problematic. And of course, you can take this to the extreme and don't even consider just marine birds, but consider everything else that's out there. And you could, if you have distribution and abundance data, you can look at it in the same sort of approach. So we bothered to tell you about this because as far as we know, nobody does this, okay? Even though the kinds of information that we collect, it lends itself to doing this. So that's where we were up until the Block Island Wind Farm was built, or at least was being built. What we wanted to finish up with is where we went post ocean sand. So the data that we've talked about is from aerial surveys that basically tells you a static view. Essentially, it's like taking a photograph, you figure out what's there, and then you look at that over time, over seasons, and so forth. But what it didn't tell us that we wanted to know was how does the use of our area connect with where birds go throughout the annual cycle, what their migratory movements might involve, and whether there's populations that we need to worry about more or less. And you need to use tracking kind of data to actually answer that. So we became part of a very broad North American-wide Great Lakes and Atlantic Coast sea duck migration study. And there was close to 100 collaborators. There's over 700 ducks that have been tracked over time. It allows us to fully describe annual migration patterns. So now we can answer the question, okay, for those scoters that we know their distribution abundance in the winter, where do they go during the summer? Do we need to worry about particular areas that are where the birds are going in the summer, or key migration corridor areas? So it allows us to look at a variety of other aspects of populations in these marine birds that we couldn't look at otherwise. So the data I'll show you is for 5 focal species of sea ducks. It happens that the southern New England area is one of the most important areas in all of North America for these wintering sea ducks. And that was part of the reason why we focused on this group of species. How do we track them? We put satellite transmitters in their bellies. This requires collaborating with some very talented veterinarians. We do all the hard work of capturing these birds in the field, and then we bring them back to some location where the vets can actually implant these in the belly of the bird. You can see in the bottom left, there's a little antenna that sticks out the back of the bird that allows it to transmit its location throughout that is transmitted to an Argos satellite. So now we can just sit at our computers and figure out exactly where the bird is at any given moment. So this is the kind of data you get from that. So this is master's work of Pam Loring. Pam is now works for Fish and Wildlife Service and is very much involved in the assessment of offshore wind energy development. And what I'm showing you in the left here is a hotspot map, we like to call it. So things that are in red are the places where these particular black scoters like to hang out more. The blue is where 95% of the time they're hanging out. And then areas where you don't see any color, those are areas that they essentially didn't use. So we could do the same thing for you if we got permission to follow your cell phone. We could tell where you like to eat, where your home is, where you like to go shopping, where you like to do a variety of other things. So it's basically just a hotspot map that tells where the birds are hanging out. If you know the resources that are there, you can then move that to what we call a relative probability of use area. And the redder colors are the areas that are the primary used areas for, in this case, black scoters. And you can overlay onto that these areas of proposed offshore wind, and you can get a sense that in this case, black scoters would not be very commonly found and prefer to use these areas. There might be some issues for the Block Island Wind Farm area. So that's for black scoters. We've done the same thing for common eiders. This is Josh Buth's master's work. He now works for DEM. As you can see, common eiders are a little more specific about their core use areas. They're very coastal in their use. And again, you can put that into a relative probability of use map. And again, they're basically not occurring in these areas that are offshore, off the shore, a little bit more use in that Block Island area. And then the third species that we've focused on, this is work by Dustin Meady on white-winged scoters. He now works for Biodiversity Research Institute, doing a lot of offshore wind energy assessment. And what I hope you can see is their use of the southern New England coast is quite different. They're much more mobile. They move back and forth between Long Island Sound and the Southern Cape area. And there are areas where they used fairly heavily along this edge of that, that proposed offshore wind energy development. In fact, there used to be a proposed area just south of Nantucket that got taken off the table because it was such an important area for white-winged scoter winter habitat use. Okay, so we feel like we've had an influence both in terms of the Rhode Island stamp and its locations, but also some of these larger, broader scale southern New England proposed offshore winds as well. Peter's going to finish with a couple other species.
Right, so there are some threatened and endangered species that birds that are in New England. One example, and there's a lot of interest in the potential impacts of offshore wind on these species. The first is piping plover, a species most of you are probably familiar with. And working with Pam Loring, we put miniature VHF transmitters on piping plovers, and we figured out their movements in the offshore environment when they leave New England, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. And what we found is that, in fact, birds departing Rhode Island and Massachusetts, they fly in the offshore environment. They make their way all the way down to Cape Hatteras and North Carolina. So they are flying through wind lease areas. In particular here, and the million-dollar question that still hasn't been addressed is, now that we know they're flying through the offshore environment, how high are they flying? So if they're flying above the rotor swept zone, then there's less potential impact for on piping plovers. Currently, based on the estimates that we have, they are flying above the rotor swept zone. So there does not appear to be, under most weather conditions, potential impact on piping plovers. And the other species we're just starting to get data on are roseate and common terns. And so I've been involved with putting transmitters on birds on Great Gull Island, which is at the entrance to Long Island Sound. And this just shows some movements of common terns in the post-breeding season where they go to the Cape before they make their way down to South America. And you can see that they tend to migrate along the coast. They weren't crossing through the lease zone. So there's a lot more people that are tracking terns, really start to address this question of how much do they interact with offshore wind, and we'll have a better handle on that in the next couple of years as more turbines are constructed and we get more information on movements. And the last thing I just want to end with is just going back to Europe where I started, is that they have done some pilot work where on one particular day, when they're based on radar studies, there was going to be a lot of mass migration. So they actually shut down or lowered the power output of the North Sea turbines to a maximum of 2 rotations per minute for 4 hours, with the hope of protecting birds and minimizing collision risk during migration. So there are things that can be recommended for in North America to minimize collision risks if we find that in fact that's an issue for birds in the United States and North America. So that's it for our presentation. Thank you very much. And so now what we'll do, we're helping to answer any questions that you might have. And it looks like the first question is, have you noticed any change overall in the population of any species since the wind farms have been in place? So that's the first part of the question. Would you care to, I can start to address that. As far as we know, we haven't seen any change in population size for any species in relation to offshore wind. Remember that these South Fork wind has just been put in place this last year, and Block Island Wind Farm, which is 2016, but it's only 5 turbines in the nearshore and doesn't really impact that much of an area. So there's a second question: is there any evidence the Block Island Wind Farm benefit birds in any way? There's no evidence that I know of yet. There's some thoughts that maybe that offshore wind farms could create habitat for fish. And then those fish, in turn, birds that feed on fish or shellfish could take advantage of the prey that is created on offshore wind. But I don't know of any data to show that that's occurred yet.
So if anybody has any other questions for us, just throw them in the question and answer box there. That's how we'd like to answer any questions that you might have.
So there is a question for Scott here: does prioritizing the safety of birds negatively affect any other kinds of wildlife?
Interesting question. So if we prioritize the safety of birds, we're placing these wind farms in areas that have that reduce the chances of displacing them from other areas. Some of those same areas are pretty important for other wildlife. I'm thinking especially a lot of the species that we study are feeding on either mussels in the case of the sea ducks, which is also food for a variety of other kinds of wildlife. So in general, I think prioritizing for marine birds tends to help and facilitate the protection of areas that other species kind of use. I can't think of a negative effect on any other kinds of wildlife.
During the aerial surveys, do you photograph and analyze later or count and ID in real time?
Yeah, so when we did these aerial surveys, we had 2 observers, one looking out of each side of the plane, and they counted in real time. Okay, there are some efforts since then of doing videography and then analyzing those photographs thereafter. My read on it is it's a bit of a can of worms, because our ability to actually identify things as the plane is moving at 100 miles an hour is actually better on average than most videography, at least to date. You get blurrier images. So in general, it's still the case that observer-based aerial censuses is the way to go. It's done throughout North America with waterfowl on a variety of bases. So the technology hasn't quite gotten to the point where we can replace humans at this point. Peter, you have one there. How do you determine how high the piping plovers are flying?
That's work done by Pam Loring based on triangulation of the VHF signal. So it's based on detection probability, the detections of the VHF transmitters from multiple receivers. So the way the pipe and plover tags work is you have a series of stations located around the region, and then if it's detected by multiple stations, you can triangulate the position and come up with estimates of flight altitude.
There are other ways to do it with other species. Piping plovers are pretty small. So with some of the satellite transmitters, they actually have an altitude sensor, so you can get direct altitude. And then when Peter and I were doing the ocean SAMP, we actually had a ground-based radar system out on Block Island that allowed us to estimate the height of any bird. It was hard to tell just with radar which kind of bird, but we could tell big birds from small birds at least. And you could get really good estimates of flight height. We didn't have a chance to talk about that today, but one of the take-home messages from that particular part of the study was a lot of songbirds migrate south in the fall along our coast. And as far as we could tell, most of those were flying by the time they made it to the Block Island wind farm area. They would have been flying well above the rotor.
There is being work to come up with, the problem with pipe and plovers are they're tiny, they're relatively small. So the transmitters, when we were doing the original research, didn't have a barometer or accurate way to estimate height, and they're working on technology now for small birds like a pipe and plover to come up with more accurate height estimates. So there's a question about, are there design measures that can mitigate bird impacts, such as height restrictions or blade lengths, etc.?
So one of the things that we wanted to make sure everybody got from our presentation was that what happens on the land as far as land-based wind farms is often quite different than what happens in the marine environment. Mainly, as Peter said, the collision risk is known to be an issue in land-based ones versus offshore wind-based ones. So the answer to the question, are there design measures that can mitigate bird impacts? There's a lot of stuff that happens on land that include things like certain kind of lighting systems. You can use detections, either infrared or otherwise, to actually detect what's happening around, and they do shut them down in some cases to reduce negative impacts when there's large migrations happening. As far as the offshore environment goes, though, I don't know of anything that involves blade lengths or height of the turbines. That's pretty much determined by how the developer wants to maximize energy production and the technological limitations of that. My hunch is it wouldn't make much of a difference in terms of collision risk because it's just not that big of a deal. But one of the things that we didn't talk about, because it hasn't happened yet as much in the US, is when Peter showed that one picture of the Ørsted based wind farm over in Europe, they had dozens and dozens. It was 50 plus turbines all in an array like that. We don't have that yet. And I do worry about, the density of those and the scale of those eventually having some more negative impact. So there might be something about the configuration of those that could be considered.
Right. And the one thing that Scott did mention is lighting. So there's been a lot of work showing that, having a steady white light on an offshore turbine could be an attractant. So that's why they have blinking red lights on them to not attract birds to the turbines. That's one thing I can think of. And the other mitigation is, I just lost my train of thought, sorry. The other mitigation I talked about, the idea before, was that my very last slide is that if there's evidence that there is a collision risk and there's a mass migration of birds, there is a possibility to shut down or slow the turbines if it gets to that point to minimize collision risk.
Yeah, it brings up the larger issue of what's the where you're placing these wind farms. What is the context for the birds' annual cycle, we like to call it? So is it a really important migration corridor area? Is it a really important wintering area? Are there lots of breeding birds that are occurring there? And in our neck of the woods in New England, it's very much a wintering and migration kind of period that we worry most about. And so, as Peter's saying, if it's a migration thing, we can predict pretty well when mass migrations are occurring, or at least we can detect them in real time. And there is the opportunity to have mitigation measures. We do that already on land. The Lights Out program for migratory songbirds, turning off lights in buildings and things like that. Those are effective ways to reduce the collision risk. And so if there's any concerns about that, I think we have the capacity to consider that. There's a question in the queue about whales. And I do know that there was a talk in this same faculty hours series just a few weeks ago on whales in particular. So instead of us conjecturing about it, you can go ahead and look at the.
There will be a link posted in a follow-up email that will send you to the whale talk. So we don't want to go out of our expertise. Are there any other questions out there that you might have? Birds.
Transmission cables.
Have there been any recent studies on the effects of transmission cables proposed to be or already installed within local waterways? Are you talking about the effects of the transmission cables on birds or other taxa? If somebody could elaborate on.
It is an important consideration. One of the things that was interesting that happened with the Block Island wind farm was it was obviously an island, and they did have to put new cabling in to get to the mainland. And here in southern Rhode Island, there was lots of discussion about where it actually had to come on to land. And those things were sort of part of the same assessing development process that we normally consider. And so, yeah, it's an issue, but it's often separate in the discussion. Like, we were never involved in talking about cabling and how that might influence things. The interesting aspect of it for Block Islanders was because they were putting cabling in, they also put in high-speed internet lines. And that was the first time that Block Islanders had the capacity to have high-speed internet. So it helped grease the wheel, so to speak, in getting approval for all that from the Block Islanders, I think. So they clarified that the transmission cable thing was talking more about breeding. Yeah. So once they make it to land,
Right.
Is there potential effects on breeding birds, things like that?
So there's a question about who funded this research, and then if developers play, how do you eliminate a conflict of interest?
Yeah, so sometimes we're asked, why don't we do all development assessment in the way that we're proposing the Ocean SAMP was done, and why it was better. And part of that answer is actually the funding. So the Ocean SAMP process, there was no offshore wind in the waters of the US. And so part of what the Rhode Island delegation did, mostly through the Coastal Resources Management Group, were very proactive in helping attract funding for an Ocean SAMP process. And then they were the ones that actually pulled together all of us and regularly met and made sure that we were all thinking about the appropriate scale and so forth and so on. So the short answer is the funding came through some federal dollars. The main funder these days of any ocean offshore wind is BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So some of the funding came from that. A lot of it came from the state, and then a very clever set of policy folks got the developer to front a bunch of monies that funded probably a quarter or more of the overall need. So the developer essentially, in good faith, provided the funding up front with the understanding that they could then use all the information that came of that. So one of the things that we didn't mention was everything that was collected, whether it's the bedrock geology to the marine birds to primary productivity, all that's publicly available, okay? And so now when they're assessing offshore wind in Rhode Island waters, they have access to all the data that we helped collect. And so there was a huge benefit to the developer. There's no way with the same dollars, they could have hired a consulting firm to collect that same wealth of information. So the short answer to the funding is multiple partners. The developer was part of that process, but in a very different way than we normally spend that money in development assessment.
There's a question about, can you speak to how do seabirds detect the turbines under different weather conditions, such as heavy fog conditions or heavy snowfall, for example? I can start in part as it depends on, there's a lot of variation among species. In the case of piping plovers, for example, if you look at when they migrate, they tend to migrate on days with what we would call good weather, so relatively clear, no precipitation. So there tends to be less migration by piping plovers and terns during days with precipitation and other conditions. So there's less birds migrating through the area.
And I think the same thing happens with the larger marine birds.
Yeah.
If they literally cannot see, they'll either go down closer to the water where they can see better or above, or if they still can't, they're just going to sit on the water. So I think the movement patterns of the birds just facilitates not running into things. And the reality is there's been a ton of studies done in Europe, and they have these cool little devices that look straight up a turbine and use infrared technology to actually detect if there's any collisions. And it's just how they do it, we've talked about, but functionally they don't, because the number of collisions is just very, very, very low. Got anything?
So the main thing, as I said at the beginning of the study, is what we're mainly concerned. We're not concerned as much about collision. It's displacement from key foraging areas. It's really kind of the major driving force behind a lot of our research. So I guess that's there are no more questions right now. So we thank you very much, and we're gonna turn it over right now. Thank you for your great questions, and we appreciate your time.
Okay, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you to Professor Paton and Professor McWilliams, and thanks to all of you for joining us.